"You're not what we need anymore, Mason," said Travis Langley, the new VP of sales, with a smug half-smile that barely masked his eagerness. "We're going in a new direction." Just like that. After 7 years of building the company's most profitable client relationships, Mason Clark was out. No warning, no gratitude, just a pat on the back and a severance folder. But Mason didn't flinch. He didn't beg or list the accolades. He didn't remind Travis that he'd just closed the most successful quarter in the company's history, or that over 60% of revenue came from his accounts. Instead, he stood, nodded once, and calmly said, "Got it. Best of luck." He left behind a shelf full of awards and walked out without looking back. At his desk, he packed quickly photos, a mug, a signed baseball from his client, turned friend Bryce. Around him, coworkers stared at their screens, pretending not to notice. Nobody spoke. But Mason could feel the tension. HR walked him through the formalities, their voices stiff with discomfort. They knew exactly what he had meant to the company. As the elevator doors closed, Mason didn't feel anger, not yet. What settled inside him was colder, quieter. Travis Langley had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and Mason knew it. By the time Mason reached the parking garage, the late afternoon sun was dipping low over Cincinnati, casting long shadows across the concrete. He tossed his jacket over his shoulder, unlocked his car, and slid into the driver's seat without starting the engine. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Bryce, his biggest client. "You free for lunch tomorrow?" Mason let out the first real smile of the day. He hadn't called anyone. He didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew. See, what Travis Langley didn't understand, what the CEO hadn't thought to ask, was that Mason's client list wasn't built from cold calls or slick sales tricks. These weren't just names in a CRM system. They were real people. College roommates, lifelong friends, former coworkers turned business owners. Most of them had worked with Mason before Veltri even existed. He wasn't just a salesman to them. He was their guy. The one they called when a system went down at 2 a.m., when a contract needed tweaking, or when they just needed someone to listen over a drink. Mason had been with Veltri Dynamics since its scrappy early days, back when their office was a glorified garage with peeling paint and one shared coffee pot. He was employee number 9. Back then, job titles didn't matter, only results did. And Mason got results. Not by promising the moon, but by showing up when it counted and doing the work right the first time. That's why his phone kept buzzing. By the time he got home, he had 12 messages from clients. Not one was from the company informing them of his departure. No formal introductions to a new rep. Just silence. And that silence made his clients nervous. Jason from Horizon MedTech left a voicemail. Some kid called saying he's handling my account now. Didn't even know what systems we use. Dave from Stanton Supply. I got a call from someone named Josh. Sounded like he just got his braces off. Did you leave Veltri or something? And then there was Allison from Rivermore Freight. Her tone was different, sharper. What the hell is going on, Mason? Some stranger just called himself my new point of contact. After everything you've done for us. Mason knew the storm was coming. But he didn't have to chase it. Back on his back porch, bourbon in hand, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Mason let the anger dissolve. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about pride. It was about something deeper, loyalty, trust. Years of showing up and doing right by people. Veltri had seen only his numbers. Travis had seen only a salary line he wanted to cut. But his clients, they saw Mason. And when you build something real with people, when you show them you care about more than just contracts and commission checks, they remember. They show up when it counts. Just like he had for them, time and again. As he took a slow sip, Mason glanced at the message from Bryce again. "Lunch at 12. Let's talk next steps." Mason nodded to himself, replying with just 2 words, looking forward. The gears were already turning. Not in some dramatic, vengeful way, but with quiet certainty. Because while Veltri had fired Mason Clark, the employee, they'd just set free Mason Clark, the rainmaker. And that was going to change everything. The next morning, Mason Clark buttoned up a crisp shirt, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and drove across town to meet Bryce at their usual diner. No frills, just strong coffee, good food, and a corner booth with enough privacy to talk business. Bryce was already waiting when Mason walked in. Business casual, but with the posture of someone who ran a multi-million-dollar logistics firm and didn't need to prove it. Didn't take long for word to get around. Bryce said as Mason sat down. Guess it never does, Mason replied, sipping his coffee. Bryce shook his head. Veltri didn't even bother telling me. Just had some junior rep call and stumble through a script. You know, we've been working together for nearly a decade, right? I remember, Mason said. You were my first major account. You helped us scale when no one else would. You saved our hides when the warehouse system crashed during peak season. You came to my dad's funeral. I don't care what Veltri says. They lost me the second they lost you. Mason didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. Bryce had already made up his mind. I've got other clients reaching out too, Mason finally said. Similar stories. Replacement reps they've never heard of. Calls at odd hours. No context. No clue what each business actually does. Bryce chuckled grimly. Sounds like Veltri thinks customers are just contracts. They forgot that trust isn't transferable. Mason nodded. That's the part they'll never understand. Later that afternoon, Mason's phone buzzed again. This time it was Jessica Alden from Clearwater Software. Another long-time client and, more importantly, a friend. Heard about what happened, she said. I'm livid. The new guy who called me yesterday couldn't even pronounce our company name correctly. You have options, Mason told her, choosing his words carefully. I'm not telling anyone what to do. But if clients are unhappy, they deserve to know their rights and their options. Jessica didn't miss a beat. Just send me whatever you can legally share. Mason didn't call it a strategy. He wasn't soliciting. He wasn't bad-mouthing anyone. But the reality was simple. Clients were coming to him. Some wanted advice. Some wanted referrals. Some just wanted to know what the hell was going on. By that evening, Mason had heard from 11 of his 18 major accounts. They weren't angry. They were confused. And more than that, they felt betrayed. Not because Mason had left, but because Veltri had treated their long-standing relationships like assets on a spreadsheet. Replaceable. Disposable. And clients don't forget that kind of slight. Back on his deck that night, a breeze rolling in off the river, Mason got one more message. This time from Dave Carlisle, his old college buddy turned manufacturing CEO. Got your replacement's intro email. Called me Mr. Carlison. My VP almost spit out his coffee. Let's talk. That was the moment Mason knew this wasn't about just one bad decision. Veltri hadn't just fired the wrong guy. They'd triggered an exodus they couldn't stop. And Mason, he wasn't chasing after anyone. He didn't need to. Because when relationships are real, they don't vanish with a pink slip. They follow the person who built them. And Mason Clark had spent 7 years doing exactly that. 2 days later, Mason found himself sitting across from Jessica Lewis, Vice President of Sales at Highmark Systems, Veltri's biggest rival, and a name he knew well from years of industry trade shows and overlapping bids. They'd always had a respectful rapport, but this time, Jessica wasn't just making small talk. We've been watching the situation, she said, pouring him a cup of coffee in her office overlooking the downtown skyline. And quite frankly, it's hard not to. Your departure has created more noise than most product launches. Mason raised an eyebrow. Didn't expect to make headlines just by walking out the door. Jessica smiled. You didn't walk out. You were pushed out. There's a difference. And from what I hear, Veltri is already paying the price. Mason remained quiet, but the look in his eyes confirmed it. She slid a folder across the desk. Director of Strategic Partnerships. Team of your choosing. 35% bump in base salary, plus performance incentives. No micromanaging. You run your division your way. He opened the folder. The numbers were solid. More than that, the language was respectful. No jargon, no forced enthusiasm. Just straight business backed by trust. There's one thing, Mason said. I have a non-compete. I'm not looking to stir up legal trouble. Jessica waved a hand. Our legal team reviewed it. Ohio law is pretty clear on this. It's barely enforceable, especially in termination without cause. But we're not taking risks. You'll start as a consultant. 2-month agreement. After that, full transition. Mason nodded. That works. Jessica leaned forward. We're not after a scorched earth play. We just want to build the right way, and we know you don't burn bridges. That's why people trust you. By the end of the week, Mason had signed on. His inbox lit up almost immediately. Not just with onboarding paperwork, but with client messages. Heard you've landed somewhere new. Would love to know where. Hope it's not too soon to ask what your next move is. Mason kept it simple. For now, He shared that he was consulting, and if any businesses had questions about their options, he'd be glad to connect them with the right folks. No selling. No pitching, just keeping the door open. But the door didn't stay open long. It became a floodgate. Within 10 days, 5 of his top accounts had paused new work with Veltri, citing internal evaluations. Another 3 requested full documentation transfers, which was corporate speak for, "We're getting ready to walk." Mason hadn't asked for any of it. But relationships, real ones, have a way of following you, even when the paycheck doesn't. Then came the call he wasn't expecting. "Logan," the voice said, unsure. "It's Jennifer Murray from Veltri." Mason stepped outside, heart steady. "Jennifer, what can I do for you?" She didn't waste time. "We're seeing disruption in your former book of business. Brian won't talk to us. Jason asked for a contract review. Jessica from Clearwater says she's moving vendors. People have questions," Mason said flatly. "And Veltri doesn't seem to have answers. Would like your help transitioning accounts, help smoothing things over." Mason exhaled slowly. "I'm no longer with Veltri. And the people you're calling accounts, those are my friends. If they're reaching out, it's not because I asked. It's because you forgot who they were." Silence lingered. Then came the inevitable pitch. "Would consider bringing you back. Same role, 10% increase. Direct access to the board." It was Mason's turn to pause. Not because he was tempted, but because the offer said everything about how little they still understood. "Thanks, Jennifer," he said at last, "but I've already moved on." He hung up not in triumph, but in clarity. Veltri had fired Mason for not fitting the new model. Now that model was unraveling, client by client, call by call. And Mason, he was just getting started. By the time Mason finished his second week at Highmark Systems, the ripple effects were no longer just rumors. They were headlines in the local business press. The Cincinnati Ledger ran a story titled, "Top Clients Leaving Veltri in Wake of Executive Shuffle." And while Mason's name wasn't explicitly mentioned, those who knew the industry didn't need it spelled out. Jessica stopped by his new office, still modest, still half empty, but already covered in notes and diagrams from his team building sessions. "Wes, who's calling our front desk asking about our client transition policies," she said, leaning in the doorway with a knowing smile. Mason looked up. "Veltri. 3 times this morning. Twice yesterday. They're trying to feel out whether we're behind the client exodus." Mason shook his head. "We're not. And they know it. They do. But they can't admit the problem is internal, not external. That would mean taking responsibility." Mason didn't reply. He didn't need to. That weekend, he hosted an informal lunch for a few longtime clients, Brian, Jason and Allison among them, at a quiet private room in a local steakhouse. There was no agenda, no pitch, just a chance for friends to catch up. But as often happens in trusted circles, business entered the conversation naturally. "I requested our account data export from Veltri last week," Brian said, slicing into his sirloin. "They said the platform was undergoing maintenance." Jason nodded. "Same. Allison, they told me my contract didn't entitle me to full transfer logs," she said, frowning. "But that's never been an issue before." Mason leaned back. He didn't push, just listened. Jason continued. "It's not technical, it's tactical." Brian added, "It's borderline obstruction. I've got my legal team reviewing the language." That evening, Mason compiled every report, every client email, and every red flag into a secure document. He didn't send it anywhere. Not yet, but he made sure it was ready. 3 days later, he got a call from Dava, a newer client but a loyal one. "You're not going to believe this," Dave said. "Veltri just tried to renegotiate my service level agreement in exchange for releasing our historical data." Mason's voice was calm. "That's not legal, Dave. I know. I told them no. But the fact they even tried, that was the tipping point." Mason called Jessica and walked her through what was happening. "They're leveraging proprietary access to try and hold on to clients," he explained. "It's not just unethical, it may be illegal. If we go public with this, we'll need airtight evidence." Jessica didn't hesitate. "Collect everything. We'll get our legal team involved." And so Mason did. Over the next week, he quietly documented every instance: denial emails, screenshots of disabled export functions, contracts misquoted by Veltri reps, and call logs with coded language like delayed activation and tiered data recovery. Then came the email that broke it wide open. A misdirected message meant for a Veltri executive that landed in Dave's inbox instead. It included a spreadsheet listing at-risk clients with recommended stall tactics, including Mason's name at the top. The subject line read, Barrett Containment Strategy. Dave forwarded it instantly. Jessica's legal team called it a gift. We don't even have to go after them. Jessica said the next morning, just show this to the right people. Clients, regulators, press, and Veltri's entire leadership implodes. But Mason, true to form, wasn't interested in a takedown for its own sake. No, he said. We'll give the clients everything they need to walk out on their own. Quietly, respectfully, and with dignity. We'll win this by being better, not louder. Jessica looked at him, then nodded. You're not just building a department, Mason. You're building a reputation. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. But deep down, he knew that reputation was exactly what Veltri had underestimated. And now, it was the one thing they couldn't copy, control, or recover. It started with a guide. Mason called it the Client Transition Playbook, a clean, straightforward PDF designed to help former Veltri clients understand their rights. It didn't contain any proprietary information, no internal data from Veltri, and certainly no direct references to confidential matters. Instead, it walked business owners through common contract clauses, data portability, service termination, confidentiality, and non-solicitation, and explained them in plain English. It also included practical checklists, how to document transition issues, when to consult an attorney, and how to request data exports using specific legal language. He distributed it discreetly, only to former clients who reached out directly or through their networks. Within days, it began to circulate. Mason didn't push it. He didn't have to. Word spread on its own. Meanwhile, he hosted a series of small, private lunches around the city. There were no logos, no company banners, no sales presentations, just business owners and IT leaders, many of whom had never met but shared the same frustrations. They swapped stories about Veltri's stall tactics, obstructive reps, and reinterpreted contracts. The more they talked, the more they realized something bigger was happening. By the third gathering, something clicked. A sense of solidarity. These weren't isolated grievances, they were a pattern. And for the first time, those affected felt empowered to push back. That week, Mason received a call from Brian. Just got off the phone with Allison and Dave. We're drafting a joint letter. Not legal action, yet, but a formal request to Veltri's board. We're demanding immediate data access, clean transition support, and a review of their post-termination practices. Mason didn't coach them, didn't write a word. But when they asked if he would review the draft for clarity, he did so gladly. Veltri's response came 2 days later, and it wasn't pretty. They denied everything, claimed technical delays, contract ambiguity, miscommunication. But the clients were ready. They had screenshots, call recordings, and email chains. They weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for fairness. At Highmark, Jessica's legal team watched carefully. You've done more to organize ethical client advocacy in 3 weeks than most lobbyists do in a year, she told Mason one morning. I'm not organizing anything, Mason replied with a quiet smile. They're just standing up for what's right. Jessica raised an eyebrow, and just so happened to be looking for a new vendor that we're uniquely positioned to provide. He chuckled. I never said that. But the truth was clear. Mason wasn't poaching clients. He was building something so trustworthy that clients came to him. That distinction mattered. One morning, Mason found a printed version of his transition guide on his desk, highlighted and annotated in red ink. A sticky note read, "This helped us push back on Veltri's refusal to release our vendor logs. Thank you, Northridge Tech." A week later, Northridge signed a 9-year service agreement with Highmark. One by one, more companies followed. Jessica stepped into Mason's office with an update. We just signed 3 more Veltri clients this morning. That brings the total to 11 in the past 4 weeks. She paused, then added, Legal's asking if we're ready to send the cease and desist letters now. We've got everything we need to stop their interference cold. Mason shook his head. No letters. Not yet. Jessica looked surprised. I want them to feel the full weight of losing trust. Not just contracts. Let them see the consequences of how they've treated people. Let the silence ring louder than any threat. Jessica nodded slowly. You really believe in this, don't you? I do, Mason said simply. Because at the end of the day, it's not about outsmarting them. It's about outlasting them, with integrity. And with that, he turned back to his notes, refining the onboarding process for the newest clients. Quietly doing what he'd always done best, building loyalty, one real relationship at a time. The pressure finally cracked them. Within a month of Mason's quiet campaign of truth and integrity, Veltry's leadership found themselves facing what no spreadsheet or quarterly forecast could spin: an avalanche of client exits and a paper trail of their own making. Executives scrambled. Account managers resigned. Legal teams sent rushed contradictory memos. But the damage had already been done. Then, out of nowhere, Mason got a call. "Logan Mason," the voice asked. It was polite, a little too careful. "Yes, speaking. This is Valerie Brent, board liaison at Veltry. I've been asked to schedule a conversation with our CEO. She'd like to speak with you directly." Mason sat back in his chair, barely surprised. "Tell her I'm listening." Later that day, Jennifer Langston, the same CEO who'd signed off on Tyler's new direction, sat across from Mason in a quiet corner office at Highmark, looking like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. "We made mistakes," she began, "serious ones." Mason said nothing, letting the weight of her words fill the space. "Would like to offer a full reversal of the transition policies, complete data access, waived termination fees, and clean handovers. No more roadblocks. That's a start," Mason said, still calm. Jennifer hesitated, then slid a formal letter across the table. "Would also like to discuss a potential acquisition. Highmark is clearly where the market is shifting. The board believes an integration could be mutually beneficial." Mason glanced at the letter but didn't touch it. "That decision's above my pay grade." "But they'd listen to you," she said, looking straight at him. He paused for a moment, then replied, "I'll pass it along." When Jessica and the Highmark board reviewed the proposal, their response was swift yes, but only on one condition: any acquisition must include fair review of all Veltry employees, especially those who had been blindsided, shut out, or forced into unethical corners under Tyler's direction. "No one else should have to go through what I did," Mason told the board firmly. 3 months later, the deal closed. Veltry Dynamics was absorbed into Highmark systems. What had started as a quiet stand for professional dignity had reshaped the future of two companies. On his first day back at the old Veltry office, now part of Highmark, Mason stepped through the glass doors and paused. The building was the same. The conference room table hadn't moved. But the atmosphere had changed. People weren't afraid anymore. In the main hall, employees gathered for a short address. Mason looked across the crowd, recognizing faces from his past. Some surprised to see him, others nodding in appreciation. "I'm not here to tear anything down," he began. "I'm here to rebuild trust, with clients, with each other. We're going to do this the right way. And that starts today." Applause wasn't thunderous. It was quiet, steady, respectful, like the man leading them. Later that afternoon, he stopped by his old cubicle, now empty. Someone had left a note taped to the monitor: "Welcome back, Logan. We missed the real leadership." He smiled softly, folded the note, and slipped it into his coat pocket. Downstairs, the executive floor was buzzing. Highmark's board had asked Mason to join them later that week, to help lead integration efforts and finalize the new strategic framework. But right now, Mason didn't think about titles, acquisitions, or quarterly charts. He looked out the same window he'd once stood in front of on the day he was let go. Cincinnati's skyline still stood tall in the afternoon sun, but to Mason, it felt different, like the view finally matched the values he'd fought to protect. Not just about surviving change, about leading it, with heart, with honor, and with unshakable belief that real relationships always outlast shortcuts. Weeks passed, and integration between Highmark and the former Veltry teams was underway. But it was far from smooth sailing. Old habits die hard, especially when they're rooted in a culture of fear and hierarchy. Some former Veltry employees remained hesitant, unsure if this new direction was genuine or just another temporary initiative. That's when Mason decided to roll up his sleeves. Literally, instead of burying himself in strategy meetings or hiding behind executive memos, he started showing up. On the floor, in conference rooms, even in the break area. Not as an overseer, but as a colleague. He'd pull up a chair next to account managers buried in client handovers, asking simple questions like, "What's slowing you down?" Or, "How can we make this smoother?" And when someone shared a frustration, he listened, really listened, and followed up. Soon, word began to spread: Logan's not just talking about change. He's actually doing it. At one point, he sat with Renee Martinez, a mid-level team leader who had been on the verge of resigning before the acquisition. She'd been demoralized, burned by years of mismanagement under Tyler's regime, and uncertain if she could trust this new chapter. "I used to love this job," she admitted over coffee, but somewhere along the way, it turned into survival. Mason nodded. "Let's change that. Together." He gave her the lead on restructuring a key client success program, trusting her judgment, and when she knocked it out of the park, Mason didn't take credit. He made sure the board saw her presentation. A week later, she was promoted. Actions like that sent a message far louder than any policy memo ever could. People mattered again. Meanwhile, clients who had stuck with Veltri through the turbulence were starting to notice a shift. Their calls were returned faster. Questions were met with clarity, not corporate spin. And when they walked into meetings, they no longer met a wall of sales scripts, but real conversations with real people. Mason also quietly started mentoring some of the younger hires, especially those who had joined during Veltri's most chaotic months. Many of them had never known what a company built on trust looked like, so he showed them, not with lectures but by example. One afternoon, Mason received an email from Brian, his longtime friend and former client, now one of Highmark's largest accounts. "Logan had dinner with the CFO last night. Told him we're locking in for another 5 years. The difference since the merger, night and day. You've rebuilt something real." Mason smiled, leaned back, and exhaled. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about restoring what had been lost. Dignity, connection, purpose. And somewhere along the way, the man who'd once walked out of a conference room carrying nothing but a coffee mug and a signed baseball had walked into something greater. Not a title. Not a bigger paycheck. But legacy. The kind built slowly, honestly, and shared with the people who helped shape it. In the weeks to come, Mason would be nominated for the Executive Leadership Council, an honor rarely extended to someone outside of the so its inner circle. And while others saw it as a pinnacle, he saw it simply as a platform, a bigger stage to do more good. But before that, he had one more thing to do. He grabbed a small box from his office shelf, the same dusty one he'd packed on his last day at Veltri, and walked it to the lobby of the newly merged company. Inside were those old sales plaques, the ones he'd left behind. He placed them in the new display case with a handwritten note. "These don't belong to me. They belong to every client who took a chance, to every team member who gave their best. Let's make the next chapter even better." And with that, Mason turned and walked back upstairs, not to reclaim the past, but to lead the future. Months later, Mason stood quietly near the window of his new office, one that overlooked the city skyline, just like the view from his old desk at Veltri. But this time there was no weight of betrayal, no bitterness left to carry, just gratitude. Behind him, his team was laughing around a conference table, finalizing a client proposal built not on pressure, but partnership. He didn't need to micromanage. He trusted them, and more importantly, they trusted each other. He thought about how far things had come, from being fired without warning to building something no one could take away, because it wasn't built on titles or power or politics. It was built on relationships, on showing up when it mattered, on doing right by people even when it wasn't easy. As Mason turned to rejoin the team, he felt it deeply. He hadn't just survived what happened. He had transformed it. Sometimes, what feels like the hardest hit in life turns out to be the doorway to something far better. Losing a job doesn't mean losing your worth. When you live and work with kindness, integrity, and sincerity, people remember, and eventually, opportunity finds its way back to you, often in the most unexpected ways. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Have you ever lost everything, only to find something even more valuable? Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more real stories of resilience, justice, and rising from what once felt like the end. Because sometimes, loss doesn't break you. It shapes you.